Let me start out by just stating it very clearly that I think that narcissistic abuse is completely unacceptable. And I want to start with that and encourage you to, remember that as I continue to talk, because I think that some of the things that I'm going to talk about today will bring up some uncomfortable emotions. So recently, I got into some hot water because of a reel that I posted about my understanding of narcissism. And essentially, what I, started to say was that my understanding of narcissism is that it is when ego is inflated to a clinical level. And the response that I got from people was something along the lines of, this is sort of like an amalgamation of responses, amalgamation of comments. Something along the lines of, Sean, why are you trying to understand narcissists? Showing them understanding is exactly what perpetuates the abuse. It doesn't matter what they do. The harm they cause is unacceptable. People who haven't been through this can't understand what it's like. So the first place that I want to start with this is that when I was younger, I had a friend who I love very, very dearly. And the connection that I felt to them was incredible. And one day, they just sort of disappeared. And I was left feeling ravaged, fucked up, confused, blindsided, heartbroken, just, all the negative emotions. And it wasn't until I worked through it with my therapist at the time that I realized I had been the victim of a covert narcissist. So the first thing that I want to say is that it totally makes sense to me that, I totally understand the pain that people go through when it comes to narcissistic abuse. And it also totally makes sense to me that anything that sounds like it could be defending them or making excuses for them would set off alarm bells in people's heads. And I know that this sounds crazy, but I'm actually making this for you. And let me explain what I mean. When I was growing up, I remember in school, they had these assemblies, basically, where they would educate us about child predators. And they would say things like, remember kids, they're probably not gonna be some creepy guy in a van asking you if you want some candy. They're probably gonna be some very nice looking fellow who, makes you feel really good. And that was in no way to defend child predators. It was to educate us, to prevent us from being harmed. And I think that the same thing is true with what I am doing here. Because if we think about narcissists as Disney villains, then what happens when you meet somebody who doesn't fit any of that criteria? When you think of narcissists as these reptilian monsters, like the sort of academic shows you, the sort of academic definition of a narcissist talks about. What happens when you meet somebody who doesn't fit any of those descriptors? You get hurt, really, really badly hurt. And so I've talked to friends and clients about this sort of thing, people who have been through narcissistic abuse, and they echo this sentiment that the academic definition of narcissism doesn't cut it. It doesn't prepare you for what you're actually going to face. Because my friend who disappeared was not a monster. There were many really lovely qualities about her. And to this day, when I think about her, there is still fondness in my heart for a lot of her qualities. And she still did real harm. And so I think that in order to actually help protect people from narcissism, we have to actually understand the root. Because understanding is not what perpetuates abuse. Condoning behavior does. So let me give you an example. Let's say that there's a couple and the man in the relationship, assuming a heteronormative relationship, the man in the relationship yells at the woman. And the woman understands that the reason that he does that is because he grew up in a household where that was the only way that he could be heard. That if he didn't yell, he had no power, no authority. And so he learned that when he is upset, when he needs to get his way, he needs to yell in order to get his needs met. She can understand that, and that does not mean that the yelling, that the behavior is acceptable, that she should continue to let him yell at her. And the same thing is true with narcissistic abuse, that you can have an understanding of the root causes of narcissism, how narcissism forms, even for a particular person, and still not condone the behaviors. And I think that honestly, this is the reason that a lot of toxic relationship dynamics form, whether it's narcissism or something else, is because of people's understanding of boundaries. That I hear a lot, in the a guy yelling at a girl. I hear all the time this idea of like, well, I told him not to, but he does it anyway. Nothing I can do about it. And I think a lot of people think that boundaries are just saying, please don't do that. And that's not a boundary. That's just making an ask. Boundaries require enforcement. If you don't have some sort of leverage, if you don't have some way to actually enforce your boundary, then it's just an ask. So, for instance, in the example with the guy who yells at the woman, an example of a boundary might sound like, if you yell at me during a conversation, I'm going to stop the conversation. I'm going to go up to my room. And, we're not going to continue the conversation until later. We can pick it back up later, but I'm going to stop the conversation if you yell at me. Recently, I ran a poll on Instagram where I asked people about boundaries, and I overwhelmingly got the response that setting boundaries is really, really scary for people. And so if you feel that way, if you feel like boundaries are super scary and overwhelming and, it feels like too much to tackle yourself, I'd love to have a free 50-minute session with you where we talk about boundary setting. And there's a link down in the description where you can schedule that. With this understanding of, why I'm talking about this at all, let's circle all the way back to what I understand as the root of narcissism, which is ego. Ego is basically just another word for identity. And identity is sort of like a costume that we wear. It's like a piece of clothing that you put on and try on. It is not you, it is something that you sort of, present to the world. And for narcissists, their ego has inflated to a clinical level. So basically what that means is that they have used ego as a coping tool in order to survive in the world. Because ego's job is to protect our emotions. The reason that it exists at all is to protect our emotions. So for instance, the example that I used in the short or the reel, was a guy asks a girl out. And before he asks her out, he's like, oh my God, she's so beautiful, she's so perfect, she's so wonderful. And then once he asks her out and she rejects him, then he says, she was a bitch anyway. And the reason that he is doing that is to put his ego is putting her down so that he doesn't have to feel the pain of rejection because he hasn't learned how to process that or because it is uncomfortable to process that. And this is what narcissists do constantly. This is something that we all do to a certain extent. We'll put other people down in order to make ourselves feel better. But for narcissists, it is at a clinical level. When narcissists do this, it doesn't mean, again, that you should, prolong the relationship, that you should condone the behavior, any of that sort of stuff. Do what you need to do to take care of yourself and get out of the relationship. The only reason that I am explaining this is because I think that if we all have a better understanding of what narcissism is and how the roots of it function, then I think that it can help us all to heal. So I think that for narcissists, they have learned that the best tool for them is their ego, is to, use their ego in some way in order to protect their emotions. And they are unable to sit with and process their own emotions. And another comment that I got as as this reel was out in the world, they basically said, like, no, that's not all narcissism is. Narcissism can run in families, which is absolutely true. Narcissism can run in families, but it's not because of genetics. Sure, there may be some amount of temperament that may contribute to narcissism, but the majority of the reason that narcissism runs in family is because of conditioning, is because, when we are growing up, we are like sponges. We model, we learn from our parents, what our parents do, what our family does. And so if you have parents or parent that is narcissist and you see that behavior, it is very common for us to mimic that behavior. Usually when people go through some sort of trauma, they respond in one of two ways. Either they respond in opposition to it, or they grow in accordance with it. So a good example of this is like a dad that beats his kid. That kid often grows up to either say, I am never going to lay a hand on my kids, or he also beats his kids. And it's the same thing with narcissism. Oftentimes, people that grow up with a narcissistic parent will either become a narcissist themselves, or they will do the opposite. And sometimes that results in people pleasing and stuff like that, but that's a whole other topic. I hope that this is clear, but I just want to say it explicitly just in case. It is not your responsibility to help narcissists to heal, right? Again, do what you got to do to get out of the relationship, to take care of yourself. The reason that I'm talking about this, the reason that I think that this education is important is because until we understand the roots of an issue, it is very hard to address it. So when you are going about your relationships and you're worried that someone might be a narcissist, don't look for Disney villains. Look for people who wield their identity like a weapon and can't tolerate their own emotions. That's how you spot narcissists. Earlier in this video, I was talking about coping skills, about ways that people learn how to survive in the world. And I think that coping skills, or identifying coping skills, is a really, really important part of any healing journey, because coping skills over time can become maladaptive. They, stop helping you and start hurting you. So if you would like to learn some more about coping skills, this video goes into detail about some cool stuff around coping skills that might be helpful. I hope that this video has been helpful, and I'll see you next time. Bye.